The Fallout series. Since its creation back in the 90s, it's left its fans with questions. Whether it be why a certain Vault experiment happened, or the nature of Vault tech in general, or if it's what's going on in Illinois or Alaska or Delaware or Hawaii at a certain time, there's always sort of gaps in the timeline that fans have tried to fill in. In Fallout 4, for example, there's one major secondary faction, the Gunners, that's always been sort of a mystery. The Gunners are, of course, a very large mercenary organization that exists all around the Commonwealth in Fallout 4. They are going to be seen in a lot of locations. You have to fight them in the story, and just looking around, you'll find them a lot. And they're very common enemies. They're a big part of the landscape, and also they're fairly important in the plot of the game. So them being mysterious and not really well known is a little strange. And then there's a mystery in the game of Fallout 76, the most recent game in the franchise, where the most important faction in the latest updates, the Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel, doesn't really appear or make an impact in any later games, and that kind of raises a canon question, a big question on how exactly this works with the canon. Does the Brotherhood disappear? Do all of them die off? What is going on, really, here? What is the situation? Well, today, I think I have answers to both of these questions. The Brotherhood of Steel in Appalachia became the Gunners. Now, it sounds crazy, but hear me out. There is evidence to support this. So, before we get into the exact connections between the factions, we need to understand more about the mystery of each to get the kind of context in which these connections occur. But first, I will warn everyone watching this that there are spoilers for many Fallout games, not just 4 and 76. So if you don't want any spoilers, please click off now. Okay, so let's get into it. The Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel that you see in Fallout 76 Steel Dawn is an expedition sent from Lost Hills, the original Brotherhood of Steel chapter. And this is all going on over 100 years before the events of Fallout 3 and 4. So this is a very early expedition from Lost Hills at a time where they were mainly isolated fighting raiders. This expedition is not mentioned in either Fallouts 3 or 4, despite the fact that Appalachia and locations in it are mentioned in those games. The Fallout 4 Creation Club has a note that makes reference to Appalachia as a greater location, so that proves that there is some awareness all the way up in New England that Appalachia exists and there are people there after the apocalypse. And then Fallout 3, which is, of course, set in D.C., which is even closer to West Virginia than New England is, by a long shot, mentions Vault 76, the vault that names Fallout 76, because that's where all the player characters come from. And that proves even more so that the locations in Fallout 76 exist in the same canon, as we know from Bethesda Confirmation, and that they sort of were known about broadly when that game was being made. So this chapter of the Brotherhood we see in Appalachia would have been known about by the Fallout 3 Brotherhood of Steel if it was still functioning or had some sort of valiant defeat, because we also know from Fallout 3 that the Brotherhood of Steel tracks their dead. So if there was some valiant last stand at the observatory fort in Fallout 76, that would be recorded, that would be memorialized. But we can conclude that never happened by the fact that it is not shown in any Brotherhood of Steel records. So that begs the question, where did they go? If they didn't die fighting valiantly as you would expect from a Brotherhood chapter, where's the Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel at the current time? So that's about the background we need for the Brotherhood of Steel. Other than that, they're a fairly normal Brotherhood of Steel chapter. The Gunners that we see in Fallout 4 in the Commonwealth are a very elite mercenary organization. And they use weapons that you see a lot with the Brotherhood. They use a lot of laser weapons and plasma weapons, rocket launchers, and power armor. They operate at a much higher level, not only of technology than the Raiders, who mostly use primitive pipe weapons, but also of organization, because they have a command structure there. Gunner, conscripts, lieutenants, there's captains, colonels, that sort of thing. They clearly have organization. They also look different. They don't wear this scrap equipment. They wear a more standardized gunner uniform. But they are still mercenaries. They are an army for hire. they fight for whoever has the caps in both large groups and small groups. The gunner gangs, since they are kind of gangs, not a full unified command, do give off some more raidery vibes, but you kind of get a sense that they're descended somehow from the military because they look like soldiers and they act like soldiers in the way they address each other, and sort of how they are organized. So you think that this is some sort of military descended organization. And they're a very formidable force in the Commonwealth because they're more organized and better equipped than raiders, so they pose more of a threat to the mainline factions you can side with: Railroad, Institute, Brotherhood, Minutemen. Another interesting thing to note that's important for our purposes here is that they don't appear in Far Harbor, which is in Maine to the northeast, but they do appear in Nuka World, which is in Springfield, Massachusetts, around Springfield, Massachusetts, we think, which is going to be west of Boston. So they exist to the west of Boston and slightly to the south, but not to the north or east. The big gunner questions that are kind of parts within the greater mystery of them is: where did they get their training? How did they become so elite, trained in laser weapons and power armor? And where are they based in? And those questions are kind of answered through this theory. If the gunners were once Brotherhood, then obviously they'd know how to use laser weapons and power armor. And not even these individual gunners, but the organization. The training could be passed down if they were originally a defecting chapter of the Brotherhood. And the aspect of their headquarters, if it was to the south and west, which would make sense given they don't exist in Far Harbor but do in Nuka World, as we said before, that would be in line with them coming from West Virginia, which is to the south and west of Massachusetts. Notes indicate that they exist in Pennsylvania and New York, which are again between West Virginia and the Commonwealth that we see in the game. The command structure obviously is not Brotherhood, but neither is mercenary work. The command structure can be explained by the time difference between Fallouts 4 and 76. That's over 100 years. Of course, the ranks that they use would change. Another connection is the fact that we don't hear anything about possible connection, excuse me. We must remember that none of this is proven or necessarily canon, but that we don't hear anything about the Fallout 76 Brotherhood, as I said before. And as I also said before, if there was some sort of defeat, some heroic last stand, the Brotherhood would have mythologized it. But they would not have mythologized is a sort of slow defection. They don't want to project that they're an organization that fractures, that deserts. So if a group of Brotherhood of Steel knights, out of desperation, hunger, and isolation out there in West Virginia, because they aren't in contact with the Brotherhood of Steel, the Brotherhood of the greater one, the Brotherhood of Steel in West Virginia doesn't have many allies. They would then, if they ran out of supplies, which is very well possible, West Virginia is verdant, but it's not going to supply them with, for example, ammunition forever. They might have to turn to mercenary work. And the Brotherhood of Steel would view this as disgraceful and just sweep it under the rug. So it would make sense why we would have never heard about the West Virginia Brotherhood of Steel in Fallouts 3 or 4. This makes sense. And the exact timeline of when the defection would occur would probably be about 60 years, I'd say, my estimate, after the events of Fallout 76, because that's enough time for the gunners to forget their Brotherhood identity, because they don't act like knights, they aren't noble, they don't align with the Brotherhood we see in the Commonwealth in Fallout 4, so they clearly don't really think of themselves as Brotherhood. That's enough time between their defection and their arrival in the Commonwealth for them to forget their identity, and it's enough time for the Brotherhood's resolve in West Virginia to weaken and for them to fracture enough to turn into mere mercenaries. Geographic direction also makes sense, the direction of desertion from the Appalachian Brotherhood, because they came from the west, so they wouldn't go back there. They wouldn't go. We can't say much about the south because we don't know much about it in the canon, but that's near the Cranberry Bog, so they wouldn't want to go in that direction. And the Capital Wasteland is a hell on earth, so they'd want to go north. So that's about this theory. If you have any ideas on the origins of the Gunners or the fate of the Appalachian Brotherhood, comment them below, and I'll see y'all around.